the Ptolemies, they were Greeks. They were running things. They had a great love of learning, and so they started creating the library, and a lot of the books were written on papyrus. Why? Because that's what Egypt did. They had the lock on papyrus. And so what happens is when Eumenes, who had been one of the generals, he was that had basically risen to power in this region, and with the help of some of the wealthy donors, he was creating a library there in Pergamum. And so, and what were they using for their library? Papyrus. Well, turns out that, yes, sir, kind of. Yeah, similar. It's like a reed of some sort, right? So what happens is there's a falling out. It is either economics, somebody's cousin didn't like some, I don't know. Whatever happened there was a falling out between Pergamum, Eumenes, and the Egyptians. And the Egyptians cut off the supply of papyrus to Pergamum. And so Eumenes goes, oh, not a problem. We will use parchment. And parchment had been in use in this area, they call it Anatolia, in this region here, for a long time. And what happened was, because of that, Pergamum became an industrial center for the making of parchment. And that's so this was, and the down in Alexandria, they continued to use papyrus. Now, eventually, it is like animal skins. Yeah. So papyrus or leather, when they were used, they were rolled up in a scroll, and they were glued end to end to make long sheets, and they were trimmed. And then this was what you were talking about, Bob, where the letters or the documents were written in very carefully organized columns. In Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, there were no vowels. They had no punctuation marks or anything like that. And so they would just write writing from right to left. They wrote from right to left, and then they continued on the next line. So if a word was not complete on this end, they just continued it on the next line. And they would have these columns, and then they continued until they ran out of scroll. And they did the same thing in Greek, when the New Testament was written. And basically, 35 feet was kind of the max length for a roll. Okay, so now think about this. We have Bill. He's got a New Testament scroll. It's 35 feet. And we ask him, now, Bill, what did John say about this? And I could see Bill trying to go through that thing physically and scroll. Well, now, what is in Revelation? Is going to be going, now, back to John. Oh, what did Mark say? And so one of the real problems with that is people who study the Bible, that was a real problem. So it gave way, the scroll gave way to the codex, and because of parchment, they were able to make these codexes or books out of real thin material, and they were able to bind a lot of them together. And so one of the first things that came about were the 4 Gospels on parchment. Okay? And we can thank the Romans for that one. Okay. And then, let's see. So, and the big thing is the Christians are the ones who drove this. Christians, you can thank the early Christians, first century Christians, for our current Bibles in the forms of these books. And the reason is there was such a thirst for the knowledge that these books were being captured in the letters, and they were being moved around, and they had to have a real lightweight, easy way to transfer them around. And that was because of the Christian. I mean, the Greeks didn't care about that, or the Jews didn't really care about it. It was the early Christians that drove the development of the codex in the form that the Bible is in today. This is the codex, and I think this is actually a picture of a facsimile of it. There's more discussion in the next class about facsimiles, but this is, and this is what Bob was talking about, very neatly captured. And the Codex Sinaiticus was written, dated back to AD 330 to 350, sometime in that. It is the oldest complete New Testament, so it has the Old Testament and the New Testament. But in the New Testament, it is the oldest complete New Testament in existence. This is it. And this is a picture of it. It was copied because they weren't around in 350, right? Okay, but these were from their letters that were copied into these books, right? And that was your point. Okay. The initial communications between God and humankind was direct communications. God would show up, talk to Abraham. He would either do it via dreams or whatever. Adam talked to them, and Eve. But eventually, this is the more enduring forms of the written records was needed. So Moses was the first person in the Bible that wrote down God's directions. So God said, Moses, go write this down. So Moses was writing in most likely Hebrew, and he was writing down. You can go back into these references here in the Old Testament, and there are 6 times that God tells Moses to actually write something down. Joshua followed Moses, and he wrote down the wisdom that he had accumulated, all of the things that he had to share. And basically over time, the rest of the prophets and all of these folks, the kings, in the poetry, all of the history, all of that stuff was eventually captured, and it was accumulated into a book called the Old Testament eventually. And then probably around by Ezra's time, it was an accepted document in total, 400 BC, okay? This is before it was translated into Greek, into the Septuagint, so it's in Hebrew. And this is when the intertestament time starts. Now, so I'm just going to put a plug in for this. If you go into, and then I'm going to stop. Yeah, I'm about halfway. Okay, so just, this is the last thing I'm going to say. We had a small group on the intertestament time. It's actually fascinating. But if you think about, and this is one of the reasons I try not to take it for granted of things that are in the New Testament. If you go into the New Testament, you will see Pharisees, you will see Sadducees, you see Romans everywhere, you see synagogues, right? If you go into the Old Testament, there's 0. And the question is, where did those guys come from? And it was happened during the intertestament time. And the whole thing, if you look at the way the Bible is constructed in all of the instructions over the years, 1,000 years, and it's all pointing to the birth of Christ. And that also pointed in the intertestament time. All of the things that happened there had to happen so that when Christ was born in 6 BC, we can talk about that one too if you want at some point, but in 6 BC, all of these things had to be in place for all of the things to happen afterwards. All of that stuff was captured in the Old Testament. The only way they did that was they had to have some way to write it down. That's what we've been talking about. That is that whole path, and that is God's plan. It didn't just happen. It was actually a part of the plan. And okay, I'm a straight line kind of guy. Okay, God doesn't work that way. Okay, God does what God does. And sometimes there are curves and things like that. But basically, if you take the Old Testament coupled with the Intertestament time, everything in there points to Christ coming to the planet. That's something to think about. Next time, we'll finish this up, if that's okay with you. Yeah. And we have, there's some more interesting stuff about the different books Bob will find interesting. Okay? All right, done.